In the last section, we started talking about some of the different concerns that we're going to have as we build our application on the front end side. So in this section, we're going to start setting up React. We're going to set up React Router. We're going to set up Redux. Now, this whole process is going to take just a little bit of time to go through, because while I am going to assume that you might be somewhat familiar with Redux, I will assume that you have not set it up from scratch before. So as we start to set it up, I'm going to talk about a couple of the different libraries that we're using and why we're using each of them, and exactly how Redux works with React as we go through this. So again, we're going to do a little bit of the basics, but in general, I'm hoping that you've got a reasonable idea of what's going on. So let's get to it. Inside of my project directory, I'm going to find my client folder. I'm going to find my SRC folder inside of there, where we can find a bunch of existing files that were generated automatically when we made our application with Create React App. Now, in this course, I don't want to use any boilerplate whatsoever. No boilerplate, zero, or at least no boilerplate on the React side. Of course, we still want all the Webpacks set up and stuff like that from Create React App. But I don't want to use any of these existing files inside the SRC directory. So I'm going to delete all of these existing files except for the register service worker JS file. I'm going to keep that one around for now. But everything else inside of here, get lost. I'm just going to delete all of them. And move to trash. There we go. Okay, so now I'm just left with register service worker inside the SRC directory. So let's get started. Let's talk about the first file that we're going to be making inside of our application. We're going to have essentially two root files. Well, one real root file, but then another one that's very closely related to it right underneath it. The very root of our application on the client side is going to be a file called index.js. This file is going to contain the initial boot up logic for the React side and Redux side of our application. We can think of this index.js file as putting together all of the very initial data layer considerations of our application, which, for example, case in point, is going to be the Redux side of things. So index.js is really going to be all about Redux. So inside of here, I'll basically just say Redux. That's what it's doing for us. Directly underneath the index.js file, we will make a single component called app.js. The app.js file is going to be essentially concerned with the rendering layer or the React layer of our application. Now, inside of this app.js file, what I'm really essentially talking about is figuring out what set of components to show on the screen. And so this is going to be the primary location for setting up all of our React Router related logic. So we can essentially imagine index.js for Redux stuff, app.js stuff for Redux stuff. Now, the very simple reason for taking this type of approach is that we're going to have a pretty good amount of configuration around both Redux and React Router inside of our application. And if we try to stuff all that logic into a single file, it's just going to get really confusing really quickly. So that's why we're going to break it out into two separate files. Now, if we kind of take this approach right here and think of it in the context of our overall application, you essentially end up with something like this. So at the very top, we have our index.js file. That's going to show an app component, and then the app component is going to show a bunch of other components inside of that. So the app is going to show things like our header component that we just spoke about 2 seconds ago. Remember, that's our header right here. The app component will also show the landing screen. It'll show the dashboard and survey new or survey form, all that kind of stuff. So again, the app component is really the root of the essentially React side or routing side of our application. Okay, so let's get to it. Let's start doing the setup. The first thing we're going to do is flip on over to our terminal, and we're going to start to install a couple of different dependencies. So I'm going to flip on over to my terminal. I'm going to kill my server completely. At this point, you might see an error message that says, hey, we can't do something with index.js. That is, of course, because we just deleted that file inside of our client directory. So we can't even really run our server anymore right now because we don't have that very root file inside the client side of our application. So I've killed my server, and now this is extremely important. And again, this is something I'm going to tell you constantly throughout this course. Remember that we have two package.json files at this point. We have one file for all of our server dependencies and one file for all the client dependencies. So when we start installing stuff around the client side of our application, like React Router and Redux and all this other stuff, we really have to make sure that we are inside of the client directory of our project. So I'm going to change into the client directory before I run any npm install commands. If I run npm install while inside of the server directory, that's going to install dependencies to the server side of our project. And so right now, the server side clearly doesn't really care about React or Redux or anything like that. Okay, so inside a client, we're going to do npm install -- save, and we're going to pull in a couple different dependencies. We're going to get Redux, we're going to get React - Redux, and we're going to get React - Router - DOM, like so. Okay, so that's going to take a minute or two to install all these things. While that's running, we'll flip up back over to our code editor. I'm going to find my src directory where we just deleted everything from. I'm going to make a new file inside there and call it index.js. Okay, so this is going to be the primary location for starting up essentially the Redux side of things inside of our application. Now we are going to also render our root component from inside this file because this is like the startup location, but we're not going to put a lot of like, say, React configuration in here. We're just going to use this file to render our very root component to the DOM. So let's start by putting together a little bit of boilerplate right now, and then we'll come back and finish it up in the next section. At the top, we will import React from, my laptop really slows down when I start to record and install modules and like do stuff at the same time, so sometimes it slows down just a little bit. Anyways, we'll import React from React. We'll import React DOM from React-DOM. And then down here at the bottom, we'll place our React DOM.render call. Remember, React DOM takes two arguments. The first argument is our root component, and then the second is where we are attempting to render that component to inside of our DOM. Now, our root component is going to be the app component. Remember, the app component, which has essentially all the routing logic of our application. So I think that maybe right now this will be a good place to take a break. We'll come back in the next section. We'll set up that root app component, and then we'll make sure that we can kind of get our application running and still show it inside the browser. So I'll save things right here. We'll take a quick break and come back in the next section.